The first time my husband looked afraid of losing me, I was standing in another man's arms. Not kissing him, not cheating, just dancing. A simple waltz at a charity gala. The kind of dance married women should be able to enjoy without causing a scandal. But when I glanced across the ballroom, I nearly missed a step. Because Lawson Reid, my billionaire husband, the man who had ignored me for 7 years, was staring at us as if someone had put a knife through his heart. The tragedy was that by then I no longer wanted him to. And the strangest part, I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no revenge, no triumph, only exhaustion. Because by the time Lawson finally noticed me, I had already spent years begging to be seen. Years sitting alone at anniversary dinners while his assistants called to explain why he would not make it. Years waking up in a bed big enough for 3 people and wondering why it felt so empty. Years pretending loneliness was simply the price of loving a powerful man. I had cried. I had waited. I had hoped. Then one day I stopped. And that was the day everything changed. Not because my husband suddenly loved me, but because another man looked at me the way a person looks at sunlight after years in the dark. A look so simple, a look so ordinary, yet powerful enough to change everything. If you had asked me a year earlier whether I would ever leave Lawson Reid, I would have laughed, because I thought my story was already written. I was the billionaire's wife, the woman who stayed, the woman who waited, the woman who forgave. I had no idea I was about to become the woman who walked away. And I definitely had no idea that the man who would change everything was not my husband. It was a stranger named Pierce Aldridge. If you have ever loved someone completely and still felt completely alone, this story is for you. Welcome to Aurora Cinema Fiction. Stay with us. I want to tell you who he was before I tell you what he became, because that is the part that matters most. That is the part that made 7 years possible. And that is the part that hurt the longest when it was over. I married Lawson Reid at 23. He was 30. Young, brilliant, already worth more than most people could imagine. Our marriage was not born from passion. It was born from 2 influential families, and 1 strategic alliance, and 1 carefully arranged future. I told myself love would come later. Maybe not immediately, but eventually. In the beginning there were reasons to believe that. The first year was not easy, but it was honest. We were 2 strangers learning each other in the specific way of people who have committed before they fully understood what they were committing to. There were evenings when he would come home and sit across from me at the kitchen counter and ask about my day with the focused attention of a man who was genuinely trying. Not performing, trying. There was a trip we took in the 2nd year to a small coastal town neither of us had visited before. 3 days. No staff, no meetings, no obligations. We ate at small restaurants and walked along beaches in the early morning and talked about things we had not talked about before. His childhood, mine. The things we wanted that had nothing to do with money or family expectations. I remember sitting on a harbor wall, watching the boats, and thinking that this was what the marriage could be, if we let it, if we chose it. He reached over and took my hand without saying anything. And I thought we were choosing it. I was wrong, not because that moment was not real. Because moments are not enough. Moments require follow-through. And follow-through was the thing Lawson never learned how to give. By the 3rd year the business had expanded in ways that required more of him than either of us had anticipated. I understood that. I told myself I understood that. I rearranged my own schedule around his. I declined invitations that conflicted with events he might attend. I made myself available in ways that required me to make myself smaller, and I did it willingly because I believed the version of him I had seen on that harbor wall was the one I was married to. It took me 4 more years to understand that the harbor wall version and the man I actually lived with were not the same person. One was who he wanted to be, the other was who he had chosen to become. And I had spent 7 years loving the first one, while living with the second. That was the man I married. The man who noticed things sometimes, the man who could be extraordinary in specific moments, and then disappear back into his own world as though the moment had never happened. And I had stayed because extraordinary moments are very difficult to walk away from when you have not yet accepted that moments are not enough. Our 3rd anniversary he remembered. He did not plan anything himself. His assistant arranged it, but he showed up. He sat across from me at the restaurant I had booked, and he looked at me over the candles, and said something that I held on to for years afterward. He said, "You deserve more of my time than I give you." I told him it was fine. I told him I understood how busy he was. I told him we would find a better balance in the coming year. He nodded, and then the following week he missed a dinner I had planned. And the week after that, he cancelled a weekend we had scheduled. And the year continued the way the years always continued, with him promising something better was coming, and me believing him, until I stopped. By the 7th year I stopped making reservations, because disappointment hurts less when you expect it. The loneliest part was not the empty dinners. It was not the cancelled vacations. It was not even sleeping alone most nights. The loneliest part was realizing that if I disappeared tomorrow, Lawson probably would not notice that immediately. And deep down I started wondering whether he would notice at all. Then one rainy Tuesday morning I walked into his office to tell him something important. Something I had spent 3 weeks working up the courage to say. Something that could have changed our entire marriage. He never looked up from his laptop. The last thing he said to me before my life began changing was, "Leave the documents on the desk." He never asked why I had come, never noticed the tears I had spent half an hour trying to hide. Just 4 casual words spoken to a woman he assumed would always be there. I stood in his office for several seconds, waiting, hoping, giving him one final chance to see me, but the only sound in the room was the clicking of his keyboard, so I turned around, walked out, and closed the door behind me. Neither of us knew it then, but that quiet click would become the sound that started the end of our marriage. 3 weeks later, I found myself standing alone in front of a ballroom mirror, trying to convince myself not to cry. Again. The annual charity gala was one of the biggest social events of the year. 500 guests, politicians, celebrities, reporters. The entire city would be there, including me, alone. Because Lawson had cancelled 30 minutes earlier. A board crisis, an emergency meeting, an important client. I honestly could not remember which excuse he had used this time. After 7 years they all sounded the same. I stared at my reflection. The emerald gown, the carefully styled hair, the diamond necklace his assistant had purchased on his behalf. A perfect billionaire's wife. Beautiful, elegant, invisible. I forced a smile, then walked into the ballroom. The evening was exactly as exhausting as I expected. People smiled politely, asked where Lawson was, pretended not to pity me, then moved on to more interesting conversations. I moved through the room the way I had learned to move through rooms like this. Graciously, efficiently, without staying long enough anywhere to be asked questions I did not want to answer. After an hour, I escaped toward one of the quieter corners near the balcony doors. I just needed a moment to breathe. A moment where nobody asked questions. A moment where nobody looked at me and saw only Lawson Reid's wife. I reached for a glass of champagne from a passing tray. At the exact same moment, someone moved behind me. The glass slipped. Golden liquid splashed across the front of my dress. A collective gasp rippled through nearby guests. For one horrifying second, the entire room seemed to stare. I grabbed a napkin and began frantically blotting the stain. "It's not helping." The voice was warm, amused, gentle, not mocking, just honest. I looked up. The man standing in front of me was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, but it was not his appearance that caught my attention. It was his eyes. Kind eyes. The kind that actually looked at people. The kind that were looking at me specifically right now. Not at the stain, not at the dress. At me. The kind I had not seen directed at me in a very long time. He removed his jacket without hesitation, without making a scene, and handed it to me. "Bathrooms down the hall. You'll have a better chance of saving the dress there." I blinked. "You don't even know me." He smiled. "That doesn't seem like a good reason to leave you standing here alone." For some reason, those words hit harder than they should have. Maybe because nobody had chosen me first in years. Not even my husband. 20 minutes later I returned to the ballroom. The stain was mostly gone. The embarrassment had faded, and I fully expected never to see the stranger again. Instead, I found him waiting near the balcony doors, holding 2 fresh glasses of champagne, one of which he offered me. "I thought you deserved a second chance." I laughed before I could stop myself. A real laugh, Not the practiced social smile I usually wore, a genuine one. The stranger grinned, and somehow looked pleased by the sound. Dangerous, I said. What is? Making me laugh. His eyebrow lifted. And why is that dangerous? Because I might start expecting it. For a second, something flickered in his expression. Not flirtation, not pity, understanding. The kind that sees beneath the words. Then he extended his hand. Pierce Aldridge. We moved to the balcony. The city stretched below us in every direction. Lights and movement, and a million lives happening simultaneously. We talked for 2 hours. Not about business. Not about connections or deals, or the kind of conversation that fills rooms like this one. We talked about books we had loved and forgotten. About a road trip Pierce had taken alone through 3 states when he was 26, and had no idea what he was doing with his life. About the specific way late afternoon light looks different in autumn than in any other season. About things that mattered. Things nobody had asked me about in so long I had almost forgotten I had opinions about them. So he asked questions the way people ask questions when they are genuinely interested in the answers. Not waiting for his turn to speak. Actually listening. Responding to what I said rather than to what he expected me to say. Then he said something that stopped me cold. You used to paint. I blinked. What? You used to paint. My chest tightened. I did. Past tense. It was not a question. It was an observation. A correct one. I had not touched a paintbrush in almost 6 years. Not since marrying Lawson. Not since slowly becoming someone else's supporting character. Pierce studied me quietly. Not with pity. With the specific attention of someone who has noticed something real and is not going to pretend he has not. Then he asked the question nobody else ever had. Why did you stop? And suddenly, I did not know how to answer. Because the truth was horrifyingly simple. I had not stopped painting because I lacked talent, or time, or inspiration. I had stopped because somewhere along the way, I stopped believing I mattered enough to keep doing the things I loved. And as I stood there looking at Pierce Aldridge with the city spread out below us, I realized something even more frightening. He had figured that out after a single evening, while my husband had not noticed in 7 years. I did not sleep that night. Not because of Pierce, at least that was what I kept telling myself. It was not his smile, or the way he listened when I spoke, or how easily conversation flowed between us. It was the question he had asked. Why did you stop? It was the fact that I could not answer it. Because somewhere between becoming Lawson Reid's wife and becoming the perfect hostess for his endless business events, I had slowly abandoned pieces of myself, one at a time, without noticing. The way you lose things when you are not paying attention to what you are losing. The next morning I found myself standing in front of a small art supply store. I had not planned to stop. I had not even realized I was driving in this direction. Yet there I was, staring through the window. Paints, brushes, canvases. Things I once loved. Things that once made me feel like myself. For several minutes I simply stood there, feeling ridiculous. Like a woman trying to reclaim a life she had already buried. Then I walked inside. That first evening back at the canvas was humbling. My hands remembered the motions but not the confidence. The colors came out wrong. The proportions refused to behave. I sat back and looked at what I had made and almost put the brushes away. Then I thought about the question, why did you stop? And I picked the brush back up. That evening, Lawson came home before midnight. An unusual event. I was sitting in the sunroom, a half-finished canvas resting on the easel. Paint on my hands. On the table. Probably on my face. He walked past me, then paused, only because the easel blocked part of his path. His eyes landed on the canvas, then on me. A brief flicker of confusion crossed his face. What is this? The question startled me, not because he asked, because he genuinely did not know. My painting supplies. He frowned slightly. You paint? For a moment I honestly thought he was joking. Then I realized he was not. 7 years of marriage, and he did not know I painted. Something inside me cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough. Oh, that was all I said. Just one word. But somehow it felt heavier than any argument we had ever had. Lawson glanced at his phone. The moment passed, and a second later he was already walking away. Back to work, back to emails, back to a world where I barely existed. The following week, I received an invitation, a charity committee meeting. When I saw the organizer's name, I hesitated. Pierce Aldridge. Apparently, he sat on the same committee. For several seconds, I stared at the email. Then, against my better judgment, I accepted. The meeting took place inside a restored historic library. High ceilings, warm wood shelving, the smell of old books and fresh coffee. The room buzzed with conversation. Volunteers discussing fundraising goals. Community leaders sharing ideas. And standing near the center of it all was Pierce. The moment he saw me, his face lit up. Not because I was important, not because I was wealthy, not because I was Lawson Reid's wife, because he was genuinely happy to see me. The realization felt strangely dangerous. Throughout the entire meeting, Pierce treated my opinions as though they mattered. Not in a performative way, not because he wanted something. He simply listened. When I suggested changes to one of the fundraising programs, he asked follow-up questions. When I offered ideas, he wrote them down. When I spoke, he paid attention. At one point, he asked me a question that nobody had asked me in years. What would you do if you had unlimited resources and 6 months and no obligations? Not what would Lawson do. Not what would be good for the family name or the foundation or the social calendar. What would you do? I sat with that question for a moment. Then I answered honestly for the first time in longer than I could remember. I would travel to every city that has a museum I have not visited. I would spend a week in each one. I would paint what I saw. Not for anyone. Just to see it. Pierce looked at me, then wrote it down. As though it mattered. As though I had said something worth keeping. Such a small thing. Such an ordinary thing. Yet it sat with me for the rest of the day. Over the next month, our paths crossed repeatedly. Always naturally. Always innocently. Committee meetings. Fundraisers. Planning sessions. Nothing inappropriate. Nothing scandalous. Just friendship. At least that was what I kept telling myself. Yet little things began changing. I started reading again. Books instead of mindlessly moving through days that all felt the same. I started painting. At first, terribly. Then, slightly better. Then one evening, I stepped back from the canvas and looked at what I had made and understood for the first time in 6 years why I had ever loved this. Because making something from nothing is one of the few acts that belongs entirely to the person doing it. Nobody could take it. Nobody could diminish it. Nobody could forget to notice it and walk away. It existed because I made it exist. And that was enough. I started laughing more, sleeping better, feeling lighter. And perhaps most importantly, I started remembering who I had been before I became someone's neglected wife. Unfortunately, Lawson noticed that too. One evening I was setting the dining table when he walked into the room. He stopped. Actually stopped. His eyes narrowed slightly, as though something seemed different about the room. Then he looked at me and understood that the room was the same. I was different. You seem happier. The statement startled us both. Because it was true, and because it was probably the first personal observation Lawson had made about me in years. I smiled softly. I am. For some reason that answer seemed to bother him. A tiny crease appeared between his brows. Then he looked away. But not before I noticed something strange. For the first time in 7 years, my husband looked unsettled. 3 nights later, Pierce and I attended a small charity fundraiser. Nothing fancy, nothing dramatic. At one point, someone at our table told a story involving a runaway goat and an extremely embarrassed mare that had nothing to do with anything and was completely absurd. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my drink. Pierce laughed too. The entire table did. The moment lasted only seconds. Harmless, forgettable. Except for one thing. Across the room, Lawson had just arrived. And he was watching me laugh. Watching Pierce beside me. Watching a version of me he had not seen in years. Maybe ever. For the first time, my husband was not looking through me. He was looking directly at me, and judging by the expression on his face, he did not like what he was seeing. That night, long after the event ended, I woke up to find Lawson sitting on the edge of our bed. Silent, motionless, staring into the darkness. Lawson? He did not answer immediately. Then finally, he asked a question that made my heart stop. A question he had never asked before. A question that was 7 years too late. Who is Pierce Aldridge? If this story has you right now, do not look away. Subscribe to Aurora Cinema Fiction and keep watching. The best part is coming. The question hung in the darkness. Who is Pierce Aldridge? For a moment I thought I had imagined it, because Lawson Reid had never cared enough to ask about anyone in my life before. Not my friends, not my hobbies, not the books I read, not the people I spent time with. Yet here he was, sitting at the edge of our bed in the dark, asking about Pierce. I slowly sat upright. He's an architect. Lawson's jaw tightened. I know who he is. Of course he did. Men like Lawson knew everything about other powerful men. What do you want to know? Silence. Then, how often do you see him? I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. 7 years of neglect. And suddenly he wanted details. Why does it matter? His expression darkened. Because you're my wife. The words hit harder than he intended. Not because they were meaningful, because they were ironic. My wife. As if those words had mattered to him during all those anniversaries, all those lonely evenings, all those years. I looked away, and for the first time in our marriage, Lawson looked uncertain. Actually uncertain. Like a man standing on unfamiliar ground and finally understanding why the ground had always felt that way. Over the next few weeks, things became strange. Lawson started coming home earlier. Not every night, but often enough to notice. He started asking questions. Small questions. Awkward questions. Questions that should have been normal years ago. How was your day? What are you reading? How is the charity project going? Every attempt felt clumsy. Forced. Like someone learning a language too late in life and aware of every mispronunciation. And part of me hated how much I wanted those efforts to matter, because they should have happened years ago. Not now. Not when another man had already reminded me what attention felt like. Then came the gallery exhibition, the first public showing of my paintings. A modest event organized by local artists in a small gallery on the east side of the city. Nothing huge, nothing prestigious. But it mattered to me more than anything Lawson had ever attended on my behalf, because it was mine, not his company, not his foundation, not his name opening a door for me. Mine. Every canvas in that room had come from something I had felt, and chosen, and made. I had hung them myself the afternoon before, stood back and looked at each one, understood for the first time what it meant to see yourself reflected in something you created, rather than in someone else's opinion of you. I did not expect Lawson to attend. Why would I? He had never shown interest before. So when I walked into the gallery and saw him standing there, I froze. Lawson stood near one of my paintings, not glancing at it, not moving past it the way people move past things they feel obligated to acknowledge, standing in front of it, really looking, reading the small description card I had written myself. His expression was unreadable. He did not notice me immediately, and in the seconds before he did, I watched my husband look at something I had made, the way I had always wanted him to look at me, with full attention, with genuine presence. With the specific focus of a person who has stopped everything else to be exactly where they are. You came, I said. He looked up. Of course. The answer almost made me laugh. Of course. There had never been an of course before. He moved to the next painting. Then, the next. Taking his time. Not performing interest. Actually looking. At one point he stopped in front of the smallest canvas in the room. A painting I had made on a Tuesday afternoon 3 months earlier when the house was very quiet, and I had felt the particular loneliness of a person who has finally accepted something they did not want to accept. Dark blues and greys at the edges. A small point of gold at the center. He stood in front of it for longer than he stood in front of any other. I stood across the room and watched him. Then I noticed something else. In the far corner of the gallery, Pierce was watching quietly. He saw me watching Lawson. He understood immediately. He gave me the smallest nod. Not goodbye. Just acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of a man who understood that some moments belong to other people. And then he stepped away. That night I understood something I had not been ready to understand before. Both men were in the room, but only one of them was seeing me for the first time. And that was not the same thing as being seen. The confrontation happened 3 nights later. Not during an argument. Not during a dramatic fight. Yes, dinner. The two of us sitting across from each other, a silence stretching between us that was different from our usual silences. This one was not empty. It was full of things neither of us had said yet. Finally, Lawson spoke. "Are you unhappy?" I stared at him, then laughed, a small, broken laugh. The kind that comes from disbelief rather than humor. "Is that a serious question?" His face tightened. "Yes." Something snapped inside me. Not anger, not hatred. The last fragile thread holding years of accumulated pain together. I set down my fork and looked directly at him. "You never cheated on me, Lawson." Relief flashed across his face. "Then," I continued, "you just abandoned me while standing right beside me." The relief vanished. "You missed anniversaries." His jaw clenched. "You missed birthdays. You missed every important moment of my life." "Sloane, no." For once I refused to stop. I begged for your attention without saying a word. Tears burned my eyes. "You know what is funny?" His face had gone pale. "I stopped asking years ago." The silence that followed felt endless. Then Lawson whispered, "I didn't know." And that hurt most of all, because it was true. He genuinely had not known. Then I said the thing I had carried into his office on a rainy Tuesday morning 7 months ago. The thing he had never let me say. "Do you remember a Tuesday morning about 7 months ago?" Lawson frowned. "What about it?" I looked at him for a long moment before I answered. Not because I was gathering courage, because I wanted him to feel the weight of not knowing. To sit in the specific discomfort of a man who has just realized there are entire chapters of his wife's life he was never present for. "I came to your office." He waited. I had been thinking about it for 3 weeks, rehearsing what I would say, how I would say it. My voice was steady, steadier than I expected. "I stood outside your door for 2 minutes before I knocked." Lawson's expression had changed. Something moving through it that was not yet understanding, but was very close to fear. "I came to tell you something I had never said out loud to anyone." The restaurant around us had gone very quiet. Or perhaps it was simply that everything outside this table had stopped mattering. "I wanted to tell you I was ready to start a family." The color drained from his face completely. "Sloane, you never looked up." The silence that followed was the heaviest we had ever shared. Not because of anger, because of everything that had been lost in a single moment that neither of us could take back. A family. 7 years of marriage. And I had walked in with the most important thing I had ever wanted to say to him. And he had told me to leave the documents on the desk. Lawson pressed his hands flat on the table. His voice when it came was barely there. "I didn't know you came to tell me that." "I know," I said. "That is the problem." A month later I moved out. Not because of Pierce, because of me. Because I could not heal in a place where I had spent years disappearing. The mansion felt different as I packed. Colder, emptier, like a house dedicated to a marriage that never truly existed. Lawson stood in the doorway watching, silent. The sight of him broke my heart. Because for the first time he looked devastated. And for the first time it was not enough. "I'm sorry." His voice cracked. The words were real, but they arrived years too late. I walked toward the door, suitcase in hand, then paused. Without turning around I said, "I believe you're sorry." Hope flickered across his face. Then I finished. "I just don't know if that's enough anymore," and left. The months that followed nearly destroyed him. The mansion became unbearable. The silence, the empty rooms, the untouched side of the bed. Every corner reminded him of what he had ignored. For the first time in his life, money could not solve the problem. No contract, no acquisition, no investment, no amount of wealth could make me come back, and that terrified him. Pierce never rushed me, never pressured me, never used my pain against me, which somehow made him even harder to resist. He was simply present in the way of someone who has decided that showing up consistently is more honest than grand declarations. He called when he said he would. He remembered small things I mentioned in passing. He showed up to things that mattered to me not because they were impressive, but because they mattered to me. One evening we sat on the terrace of a restaurant overlooking the city, watching the lights below, talking about nothing important and everything that was. Then he turned toward me and finally said the thing we had both been circling for months. "I love you." The words landed softly. No pressure, no expectation, just honesty. My heart ached. Because I knew they were real. Pierce smiled sadly. As much as I want you to choose me. He looked away toward the city lights. I want you to choose what's right for you more. I stared at him, speechless. Then he added, if that path ever leads to me, I'll be grateful. For the first time in years I cried, not from sadness, but because someone had finally loved me without asking me to become less. 2 weeks later I received an offer, a prestigious art residency abroad. 6 months. Fully funded. The kind of opportunity I would have dismissed without a second thought 3 years earlier. Because 3 years earlier, I did not believe I was worth the space it would take up. I told Pierce about it over coffee. He was quiet for a long time. Then he looked at me. When do you leave? I stared at him. I haven't said yes yet. I know. He set down his cup. But you should. Pierce, if staying with me costs you that, then I'm the wrong man for you. He said it without drama, without self-pity. The way people say true things when they have decided the other person matters more than the outcome. I looked at him for a long time. You are not the wrong man, I said quietly. He smiled. Then go, and come back knowing that. I went, and I came back knowing exactly that. A year after I moved out, I returned to the mansion to collect the last of my things. I had not been back since the morning I left. The house felt different, smaller somehow, or perhaps just emptier in a way that had nothing to do with furniture. Lawson answered the door himself. No assistant, no staff. The man who had once run an empire from behind a desk was standing in his own doorway in a plain shirt with flour on his hands. He had been cooking, badly judging by the smell drifting from the kitchen. He saw my expression. I let the staff go, he said simply. Why? He stepped aside to let me in. Because I spent 7 years having people manage everything around me. I thought it was efficiency. He looked at his hands. It was just distance. I walked inside. The house was clean, but lived in differently than before. Quieter. More honest somehow. Less like a display, and more like a place someone actually inhabited. Then, I stopped. In the corner of the sunroom. Still exactly where I had left them. My painting supplies. The easel, the brushes. The unopened tubes of paint, untouched, preserved, as though moving them would have meant admitting something he was not ready to admit. I couldn't move them, he said from behind me. I did not turn around. I kept thinking you might come back for them. A pause. I kept hoping. I stood there looking at the supplies for a long moment. Then Lawson said the thing that cost him the most to say. I spent 7 years asking everyone what I needed. Lawyers, investors, board members. People who were paid to tell me what I wanted to hear. His voice was steady, but only barely. I never once asked what you needed. I turned around. He was not performing. He was not managing the moment. He was simply standing there, a man who had finally understood something too late, and was living inside that understanding, every single day. Therapy. Counseling. Self-reflection. Not the kind anyone applauds. The kind that happens alone, in empty rooms. At 4 in the morning, when there is nothing left to distract you from who you have been. He had stopped trying to buy forgiveness. Stopped sending things. Stopped making gestures that cost money instead of effort. Instead, he had learned to sit with what he had done, which was the hardest thing he had ever done, and the most necessary. I know, I said, not because it fixed anything, because understanding is not the same as forgiving, and forgiving is not the same as returning. But I understood, and that was something. 2 years later, I was sitting alone in a cafe on a Tuesday morning. No particular reason for the cafe, no meeting, no obligation. I had simply wanted coffee and a window seat, and an hour with no one needing anything from me. I had a book open on the table, a sketch pad beside it. I had been drawing small things between pages. The woman at the counter, the tree outside losing its last autumn leaves. The particular way steam rises from a cup when the room is cold. Nobody was watching me. Nobody was waiting for me to be something. I was simply there. And the morning felt complete. My phone buzzed. Pierce, asking if I wanted to have dinner Thursday. I smiled, and typed back yes. Then it buzzed again. Lawson, asking if I had received the foundation donation his company had processed. I had. I replied with a brief thank you. Then I put the phone face down and went back to the book. Both men were part of my life. Not in the way people expect when they hear a story like this. Not dramatically. Not romantically. Just honestly. Pierce remained close. The kind of close that does not require definition, because it has already proven itself through time and consistency, and showing up without being asked. Lawson remained changed. Not perfectly. Not without occasional slipping back into old habits that required gentle correction, but genuinely changed in the way that only happens when a person has decided that the previous version of themselves is something they refuse to return to. Everyone who knew the story expected a choice, one man or the other, as though my life could be reduced to a romantic conclusion. They were wrong, because the most important thing I had learned during those 2 years had nothing to do with either of them. I had learned it on a Tuesday morning in a cafe, with a sketch pad and a cup of coffee, and nobody watching. I was enough on my own. Not as a declaration, not as something I had decided to believe because it sounded right. As a fact, I had proven to myself one ordinary morning at a time, and that knowledge changed everything. A week before the foundation opening, Pierce came to see the gallery space. Not as a guest. I had asked him, because he was the person who had first asked me why I stopped, and it felt right that he should see what had happened after I started again. He walked through the room slowly, the same way he did everything, without rushing, without performing a reaction, just looking. He stopped in front of the last painting for a long time, the dark edges and the light breaking through, and the woman standing in the middle of both. He did not say it was beautiful. He did not say he was proud of me. He turned and looked at me across the room. "You found your way back," he said, simply, as though it was the most ordinary thing in the world, as though he had never doubted it for a moment. I smiled. "You helped." He shook his head. I asked a question. "You did everything else." We stood in that room together for a little while longer. Two people who had found each other at exactly the right time, and understood without saying it, that right time does not always mean forever, that sometimes the most honest love is the kind that hands you back to yourself, and trusts you to know what to do next. 6 months later, I opened my own art foundation, a place dedicated to helping young artists pursue dreams they had almost abandoned. The kind of place that would have changed my life if it had existed when I was slowly stopping painting, and slowly stopping believing I mattered. The opening ceremony was crowded. Friends, supporters, artists at every stage of their journey, young people who had been told their dreams were impractical, older people who had set their work aside for someone else's life, and were only now picking it back up. People who understood what it felt like to stop, and people who understood what it cost to start again. And among the crowd stood two familiar faces, Pierce and Lawson, both smiling, both proud, both part of my story, but neither defining it. Because for years I had been someone's wife, someone's responsibility, someone's forgotten obligation. Now, I was simply myself. And the room I had built was full of people who had come not because of whose wife I was, or whose name I carried, but because of what I had made. Before the ceremony began, I slipped away from the crowd. Just for a moment. I walked into the back room where my paintings hung, waiting to be moved to the main gallery. Alone, no guests, no cameras, no one to perform for. The room was quiet, in the way that rooms are quiet when something important is about to happen in them. I walked slowly past each canvas. 6 months abroad in one painting, the harbour wall from that coastal town in the 2nd year of our marriage in another, the small point of gold at the centre of dark blues that Lawson had stood in front of for longer than all the others. The first painting I had made after picking up the brushes again, terrible, honest, mine. I stopped in front of the last canvas. The one I had made the morning after I finally understood why I had stopped, dark at the edges, light breaking through the centre, a woman standing in the middle of both, neither swallowed by the dark nor blinded by the light, just standing, just present, just herself. I picked up a small brush from the table beside me, turned it over in my hands, the weight of it familiar in a way that felt like coming home, not to a place, to myself. The funny thing was that I spent years waiting for someone to choose me. In the end, I was the one who finally did. I set the brush down gently, walked back toward the sound of voices and laughter, and a room full of people who had come to see what she had built. The billionaire noticed her too late. The good man loved her at the right time. But neither of them saved her. The woman who picked up a paintbrush did. She did not leave to find herself. She painted her way back. And the woman walking into that room was not the same person who had stopped. Thank you for spending this time with us. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs it today. Subscribe to Aurora Cinema Fiction. Leave a comment below and tell us where in the world you are watching from. You might be surprised how many people felt exactly what you just felt. And remember, every story we tell is made with one purpose: to make you feel deeply and remind you that love in all its forms is always worth fighting for.